You notice it in small moments. You're in a conversation. People are animated, expressive, laughing loudly. And you're there, present, listening, but quieter, not withdrawn, not upset, just less reactive. You don't exaggerate your expressions the way you used to. You don't rush to fill silence. You don't intensify your reactions to match the room. And afterward, a strange thought appears. Why do I feel detached? You're not numb. You still care. You still understand what's happening around you. But something is different. Earlier, you were more expressive, more quick to respond, more emotionally available in visible ways, more socially energetic. Now, your energy feels contained, and containment can feel like distance. You may even worry that something is wrong. Why don't I feel as excited? Why am I less animated? Have I become cold? But pause. Are you cold, or are you simply not performing anymore? Carl Jung described the persona as the social mass we develop to function within society. It helps us adapt. It helps us belong. It helps us maintain roles. The persona is not inherently false. It is necessary. But over time, many people over-identify with it. They become the energetic one, the funny one, the agreeable one, the emotionally intense one, the impressive one. And maintaining that identity requires effort. You may not have noticed how much effort, but your nervous system did. Think about how you use the enter rooms. You scanned for approval. You adjusted your tone. You amplified certain traits. Maybe you laughed louder than necessary. Maybe you offered more enthusiasm than you genuinely felt. Maybe you responded instantly to maintain image. None of this was malicious. It was adaptive. You were maintaining belonging. But performance consumes energy. When self-awareness increases, the need to perform decreases. And when performance decreases, something strange happens. Attention shifts. Earlier, you may have received immediate feedback. People reacted strongly to you, engaged intensely, responded quickly. Now, your neutrality doesn't provoke the same response. And that shift can feel like invisibility, not dramatic invisibility. Subtle. You speak calmly. No one reacts dramatically. You don't overshare. Conversations feel quieter. You stop exaggerating vulnerability for connection. The emotional intensity decreases. And you think, why does this feel distant? It feels distant because you are no longer amplifying yourself. You are no longer performing emotional intensity to generate response. Earlier, performance created feedback loops. You energized a room. The room energized you. Identity reinforced itself. Now, without amplification, the feedback loop softens. And without constant feedback, you feel less stimulated. Less stimulated can feel like detachment. But stimulation and authenticity are not the same. Authenticity is often quieter, more grounded, less dramatic. You may notice this especially in group settings. Earlier, you might have tried to maintain presence. Now, you are comfortable fading slightly into observation. You contribute when you genuinely have something to say. You don't compete for airtime. You don't inflate your reactions. And the absence of inflation feels unfamiliar because your nervous system was accustomed to performing engagement. There's also a subtle grief here because performance created a certain type of validation. When you were more animated, people reacted more visibly. Now, your calmness does not provoke as much excitement, and that can trigger insecurity. Am I less interesting now? Do people care less? But consider this. Were they responding to you or to your performance? That question can be uncomfortable. Performance attracts attention. Presence attracts depth. Depth develops slower. And in the space between performance and depth, there is quiet. That quiet can feel like loss, especially if you once equated intensity with connection. You may also notice that you feel less urgency to respond immediately. You don't double text. You don't chase reactions. You don't over-explain to maintain engagement. Earlier, you might have rushed to clarify misunderstandings. Now you allow space. That space feels mature, but it can also feel distant because you're no longer anxiously managing perception. Jung emphasized that over-identification with persona leads to fatigue. When the persona loosens, the ego initially feels destabilized because identity was tied to reaction. Without reaction, who are you? That question surfaces subtly. You may feel less dramatic internally. Less highs, less lows, more neutrality. And neutrality can feel like emptiness if you're used to emotional spikes. But neutrality is not numbness. It is regulation. Regulation feels steady. But steady is less stimulating. This stage often confuses people. They interpret reduced performance as depression. But depression feels heavy and hopeless. This feels calm. You still care. You still function. You still feel. You just don't amplify. You no longer exaggerate excitement. You no longer dramatize disappointment. You no longer overexpress to secure a connection. And because of that, social environments feel different. Earlier, you may have felt essential to certain dynamics. Now you are less central, not because you are excluded, but because you are not actively positioning yourself at the center. That shift can feel like shrinking, but it is not shrinking. It is unmasking. Unmasking feels like exposure at first. Without the persona's exaggeration, you are simply present. And simple presence does not always command attention, but it commands integrity. There is also a nervous system recalibration happening. Performance often comes with heightened arousal, quick reactions, high energy, visible enthusiasm. When you stop performing, your arousal decreases. You feel calmer, but calm can feel flat if you're used to stimulation. This flatness is not emotional death. It is nervous system stabilization. You are no longer oscillating between performance highs and exhaustion lows. You are steady. Steady can feel boring, especially if part of your identity was built on being dynamic. You may even receive subtle feedback. You seem quieter. You're different. You're more reserved lately. These comments can trigger doubt because you associate reserve with distant. But reserve can also mean grounded. Grounded does not seek constant reaction. Grounded does not inflate emotion for effect. Grounded simply responds proportionally. You may also notice that certain relationships shift. If someone was attached to your animated persona, your neutrality may confuse them. They may feel less chemistry, less intensity. But intensity fueled by performance is unstable. Authenticity builds slower bonds. And slower bonds feel quieter. You are not disappearing. You are removing exaggeration. But without exaggeration, identity feels less dramatic, and drama often equates a presence in social settings. The question here is subtle. Do you feel empty, or do you feel calm? If you feel calm but less stimulated, you are likely transitioning out of performance. If you feel heavy and hopeless, that is something different. Most people in this stage feel lighter internally, but less reactive externally. That contrast feels strange, because identity used to be tied to visible expression. Now, identity is more internal. You no longer need to prove warmth. You no longer need to prove excitement. You no longer need to prove emotional intensity. And without proof, you feel invisible. But invisibility and authenticity often overlap during transition. You are not detached. You are simply no longer amplifying yourself for validation. The persona is loosening, and when the mask drops, the face underneath may feel quieter than expected. The real question is not, why do I feel detached? The real question is, who was I performing for? Because when that answer becomes clear, detachment transforms into authenticity. And authenticity, though less dramatic, is far more stable. The discomfort intensifies when you realize something deeper. It's not just that you're quieter. It's that you don't feel compelled to manage how you're perceived anymore. And that shift changes your entire social experience. Earlier, you may not have consciously thought, I need to perform, but you felt the impulse. You felt the urge to respond quickly, to appear engaged, to show visible emotion, to keep the energy high. Now, that impulse is weaker. You don't rush to fill silence. You don't exaggerate agreement. You don't amplify reactions for effect. And without those behaviors, something unexpected happens. The room doesn't revolve around you the same way. Conversations move on without dramatic pauses. Your quieter responses don't spark the same visible reaction. Your neutrality blends into the background, and that blending can feel like fading. This is where the ego becomes unsettled. Because if identity was partially built on reaction, the absence of reaction feels destabilizing. Carl Jung described the persona as a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. It is the interface between you and the world. When that interface loosens, social dynamics shift. The persona is not fake. It is adaptive, but over time, many people inflate it. They become overexpressive to secure belonging, over-accommodating to avoid conflict, over-impressive to maintain status, over-emotional to create intensity. Inflation generates attention. Attention reinforces identity. When you stop inflating, the reinforcement decreases. And without reinforcement, you feel less visible. That can trigger subtle insecurity. Was I only interesting because I was animated? Did people respond to me or to the energy I projected? These questions are uncomfortable because they reveal how much of social engagement is performance-based. You may notice that when you speak calmly, people interrupt more easily. When you don't overemphasize emotion, your statements don't command the same attention. When you don't overshare vulnerability, conversations feel less dramatic. This is not rejection. It is recalibration. The room was accustomed to a louder version of you. Now, you are regulated. Regulation feels less urgent, less reactive, and urgency often commands attention. You may also feel detached from your own emotional expression. Earlier, emotions surfaced quickly. You reacted instantly. Now there's a pause. You observe your reaction before expressing it. That pause creates space, but space can feel like distance. You might think, why don't I feel as intense as I used to? Because intensity was partly fueled by ego investment. When ego investment decreases, emotional spikes soften. This is not numbness. It is integration. But integration feels less dramatic. There is another layer to this shift. When you stop performing, you stop anticipating reactions. Earlier, you may have subtly tracked how others responded. Did they laugh? Did they approve? Did they seem impressed? That tracking kept you socially attuned, but also hypervigilant. Now, you speak and let the reaction land without obsessively managing it. That freedom feels calmer, but it also reduces stimulation. Performance creates adrenaline. Authenticity creates steadiness. Adrenaline feels alive. Steadiness feels quiet. If you build identity around being dynamic, steadiness may feel like loss. But ask yourself, were you energized or were you activated? Activation feels intense, but it often leads to exhaustion. You may remember leaving social settings in the past feeling overstimulated but satisfied. Now, you leave feeling neutral, not drained, not exhilarated, just steady. And steady can feel underwhelming because your nervous system was conditioned to equate intensity with connection. Without intensity, connection feels softer, and softness can be misinterpreted as detachment. You may also notice a reduction in people-pleasing behaviors. You don't laugh automatically. You don't mirror personalities as quickly. You don't adjust tone as dramatically. This makes you less socially malleable, and less malleability can reduce immediate social harmony. Some people may feel your shift. They may say you seem more serious, more distant, less expressive, but what they are sensing is a reduction of unconscious adaptation. Earlier, you bet more easily. Now, you remain more stable. Stability can feel rigid to those accustomed to your flexibility, but it is not rigidity. It is alignment. There is a subtle grief in realizing how much of your former connection was fueled by performance, not because it was fake, but because it required overextension. When you remove overextension, certain dynamics naturally weaken. You may feel less central in certain friend groups, less emotionally entangled in certain relationships, less reactive in certain conflicts, and that reduction in entanglement can feel like loss of closeness. But entanglement is not the same as intimacy. Entanglement is reactive. Intimacy is deliberate. Intimacy builds slowly, without dramatic spikes. When you stop performing, you also stop competing. Competing for attention, for approval, for emotional dominance. You no longer need to be the most expressive voice in the room. You are comfortable contributing proportionally. That proportionality may reduce spotlight moments, but it increases internal peace. Earlier, you may have felt a subtle pressure to maintain image, to be consistent with the persona others expected. Now, you allow yourself to be quieter, even if it disrupts that expectation. This can create a temporary sense of invisibility, because the old image is dissolving. But invisibility in this stage is transitional. You are not unseen. You are simply less exaggerated. The ego resists this shift because it confuses reduced stimulation with reduced value. But value is not measured by reaction volume. It is measured by authenticity. There is also something stabilizing happening beneath the surface. When you stop performing, you conserve energy. Energy that was previously spent managing perception becomes available for self-reflection. You may feel more introspective, more internally focused, less externally reactive. This inward orientation can feel like detachment from social drama. And that detachment is healthy. You are no longer pulled into every emotional wave. You observe more, react less. This reduces volatility. Volatility often masquerades as vibrancy, but vibrancy fueled by volatility is unstable. Now, your vibrancy is quieter, less theatrical, more grounded. The challenge in this stage is tolerating the drop in external reinforcement. Can you remain authentic even when reactions decrease? Can you accept quieter engagement without reverting to exaggeration? Because the temptation is real. When you feel invisible, you may want to amplify again, to reintroduce intensity, to reclaim attention. But that would be regression into performance. Stabilization requires staying grounded even when the spotlight dims. You are not disappearing. You are recalibrating your relationship to attention. Earlier, attention confirmed identity. Now, identity is less dependent on attention. That independence feels unfamiliar, but it is mature. The feeling of detachment is not emotional absence. It is the absence of exaggerated social investment. And without exaggerated investment, you feel less entangled, less dramatic, less reactive, but more stable. The question now becomes, can you tolerate being seen without being amplified? Because that is a transition from persona-driven identity to authentic presence. And that transition always feels quieter before it feels powerful. At some point, the silence stops feeling uncomfortable. The reduced reactions stop feeling threatening. And you begin to realize something subtle but important. You are not detached from people. You are detached from a need to manage them. That distinction changes everything. Earlier, part of your energy was spent anticipating. How will they react? Do they like what I said? Should I adjust my tone? Should I add more emotion? This constant micro-adjustment kept you socially engaged, but also internally divided. Now, when you speak, you don't monitor the room the same way. You express what is proportionate, and then you let it land. No chase, no exaggeration, no performance recovery. That steadiness feels unfamiliar at first, because your identity may have been built around being emotionally dynamic. When you remove the dynamic edge, you feel neutral. And neutral can feel invisible. But invisibility and authenticity often overlap during integration. The ego equates attention with existence. If fewer people react, it whispers, maybe I'm fading. But fading implies disappearance. What's happening is simplification. You are no longer amplifying traits to sustain identity. You are allowing your natural baseline to emerge. That baseline is quieter, less reactive, less urgent, less inflated, but it is also more stable. You may notice something new in conversations. You listen more deeply. You speak less frequently, but more deliberately. You don't rush to entertain or impress. And when someone misunderstands you, you don't immediately correct them unless it truly matters. That restraint is integration. Earlier, misunderstanding felt threatening because identity felt fragile. Now, identity feels less dependent on external confirmation, so you conserve energy. There's also a shift in how you experience emotional intensity. You still feel emotions, but they move through you more cleanly. without dramatization, without escalation, without turning into a social performance. For example, if you're excited, you express it, but you don't exaggerate it to amplify response. If you're disappointed, you acknowledge it, but you don't expand it to create intensity. This proportionality feels grounded. But if you were used to emotional amplification, groundedness can feel flat. Flatness, however, is not emptiness. It is regulation. Regulation does not produce constant highs. It produces steadiness. And steadiness builds trust, internally and relationally. You may also notice that some people adjust to your new baseline. The ones who valued your performance may feel less engaged. The ones who value your presence may lean in more slowly, but more authentically. Performance attracts quickly. Authenticity filters gradually. That filtration can feel like social reduction, but what remains is more aligned. There's a maturity in allowing yourself to occupy space without embellishment. You no longer need to be the most animated, the most intense, the most responsive. You are comfortable being proportionate, and proportion does not seek spotlight. It seeks coherence. Coherence is less flashy, but more sustainable. Earlier, after social settings, you may have felt exhausted, not because you dislike people, but because you were managing identity continuously. Now, you may leave feeling steady, not euphoric, not depleted, just neutral. Neutrality is unfamiliar if your baseline was stimulation, but neutrality allows longevity. You are not burning energy to maintain image. You are conserving it to maintain alignment. This stage also reveals something humbling. Much of what felt like connection in the past was co-created intensity. You matched energy. You amplified emotion. You generated momentum. Now, without amplification, some dynamics feel quieter, and quiet can feel less exciting. But excitement is not the same as intimacy. Intimacy grows in calm spaces. When you stop performing, you give relationships the opportunity to deepen without drama. Some will not. Some were sustained by performance alone. That realization may sting, but it is clarifying. You are not disappearing. You are revealing who remains when exaggeration is removed. There's also increased tolerance for silence. Earlier, silence in conversation may have felt awkward. You filled it quickly. Now you allow it. Silence no longer threatens identity. You do not interpret it as rejection. You interpret it as space. That ability to sit in silence reflects internal security. Security does not need constant affirmation. Security does not need to dominate interaction. Security allows neutrality. If you reflect honestly, you may realize that you feel more like yourself now. Less animated, perhaps, but more authentic. Less dramatic, but more stable. The detachment you initially fear begins to feel like groundedness. You are not pulled into every emotional wave. You do not escalate minor tensions. You do not inflate personality traits to maintain presence. And because of that, your nervous system remains calmer. Calm can feel less visible, but it feels safer. There's a quiet dignity in no longer chasing reaction, in no longer tailoring yourself excessively, in no longer amplifying to feel seen. You are present without performance. And presence without performance is powerful, though understated. The real work in this stage is tolerating reduced external validation. Can you remain steady when attention drops? Can you stay authentic when reactions soften? Because there will be moments where you feel tempted to reintroduce performance, to reanimate the room, to reclaim intensity, to prove vibrancy. But each time you resist that urge, your identity stabilizes further. You realize, I don't need to perform to exist. That sentence changes your relationship with people. You engage because you want to, not because you need to be seen. You contribute because it feels aligned, not because you need reinforcement. You leave when you are done, not when attention fades. This is freedom from persona inflation, not freedom from society. Freedom from exaggerated adaptation. You are not detached. You are simply no longer performing belonging. You belong without amplification, and that belonging feels quieter, but it feels real. The mask is loosened, and underneath it is not emptiness. It is steadiness. The challenge is trusting that steadiness without trying to make it louder. because the more you allow it, the more natural it becomes. And eventually, you no longer miss a performance. You recognize that what you gained, internal coherence, is far more valuable than what you lost, exaggerated attention. You are not disappearing. You are integrating. And integration does not shout. It stabilizes. That stabilization is what authenticity feels like when it is no longer seeking applause. You are not detached. You are undramatic. And undramatic can feel unfamiliar when you're used to intensity. When the persona loosens, the exaggerated traits soften. The amplified reactions settle. The emotional spikes regulate. And without those spikes, you may momentarily feel invisible. But invisibility is not the same as absence. You are not fading. You are simplifying. Carl Jung described the persona as the interface between the individual and society. When we over-identify with that interface, we mistake reaction for identity. When the mask drops, the ego panics, because applause decreases before authenticity stabilizes. But here is the shift. You no longer need to perform excitement to feel alive. You no longer need to exaggerate warmth to feel connected. You no longer need to amplify emotion to feel real. You can simply be present. Presence is quieter than performance, but it is stronger. Detachment would feel cold and disconnected. What you are experiencing is steadiness. And steadiness is what remains when you stop negotiating your identity for attention. You are not disappearing from a room. You are just no longer competing for it. And that is growth. Now take a moment and reflect honestly. When did you stop performing? What changed in you? Not what others noticed, but what you felt internally. Share that shift in the comments. Not to explain yourself, just to acknowledge it. And if you're learning how to stay present without overextending, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey through Carl Jung's wisdom. We're not chasing intensity here. We're building stability.